Case 623 by Danny Yu. Chapter 19. Sir, the situation was getting out of hand. Memories and self-awareness began to return as early as 3 months ago. He became aware of the situation about a month later. He was... Maybe I better show you some of the surveillance? A long pause, coupled with disapproving eyes and a squirming medical technician, then... Perhaps you'd better.
Jarvis! Tony said, trying to keep himself together, trying to keep from panicking. Track the chip. Right now! In progress, sir,
Jarvis responded. Tony's heart was pounding. He could feel his whole body shaking, could feel his helmet closing in on him. It took so much out of him not to give in to the panic that he almost collapsed with it. Still, he made himself breathe deep and keep calm, look more closely at the empty husk of the iron cradle.
Jarvis!
Is that... He trailed off, swallowed, near staggered under another wave of terror.
Yes, sir,
Jarvis said, and it might just have been Tony projecting, but he was pretty sure he heard his own fear reflected in Jarvis's mechanical voice.
Judging by the blistering in the paint and the deformation of the metal, the cradle has been exposed to significant amounts of heat. Not enough, I believe, he quickly added, to have caused significant damage to Master James.
Significant damage was not the same as no damage, which was absolutely the only thing Tony was in any way alright with. He glanced down at his hands. Even in the gauntlets, they were shaking. His knees felt like rubber with Jarvis locking the jaws of the armor. Tony probably would have collapsed. Something distressingly like a sob was caught in his throat. For a moment, it was all he could do to just keep his breathing somewhat steady, keep out of hyperventilation territory. There was a part of him locked in somewhere in the back of his mind that wanted nothing more than to just break down and cry and wait for someone to come and take this off him. He shoved that urge away. He had more than 40 years' experience to tell him no one was coming. Besides, he wouldn't want to lay down and quit without Jamie. This wasn't getting better until he had Jamie back, could make absolutely sure his son was all right. He just maybe wished he wasn't so alone. And yeah, sure, there were the adventures. There was Natasha out looking into what happened to Happy. There were Steve and Bruce on call, and he knew he could call up Brody, but none of them would feel this way, and that mattered. Suddenly, that mattered a lot. Most of the time, Tony was selfishly grateful to have Jamie all to himself, but there were times, the best and the worst ones, mostly, where he felt the lack of a parenting partner, or what the hell you'd even call it, so keenly that it hurt. Right now, he'd have really liked not to have to be the only strong one.
Sir,
Jarvis said, and Tony straightened his spine, throwing off the pathetic internal whining as well as he could, which was pretty well. He'd known whining didn't get you anywhere since he was a toddler.
May I point out that some of the heat marks resemble human handprints?
Tony swallowed, somehow keeping himself steady.
Extremists,
he said.
Could you send an alert back to everyone? Yes, sir, Jarvis said. Tracking complete. Master James appears to be in Miami, the same coordinates where we tracked the Mandarin broadcasts.
There was a pause.
Sir, I'm afraid the chip is not picking up on any signs of life.
For a moment, the world stopped. Time didn't matter. If Jarvis was still speaking, Tony wasn't hearing him. For that moment, absolutely nothing happened. Tony wasn't thinking anything, wasn't feeling anything. Everything had just stopped. And then it all crashed into him, striking in a way nothing ever had. It wasn't despair or grief or anything like that. Sure, it was there. He could feel it lurking in the background, threatening to come out and overwhelm him. But what hit him was rage, unlike anything he'd felt before. It burnt through him, fiery and icy all at once, until he was grinding his teeth. His repulsors whined, charging up. He needed a target. He needed a goddamn fucking target right the fuck now! Let's go, he said, and he didn't even recognize his own voice. Jarvis didn't speak, could probably read him well enough to know that right now it would not be appreciated. He simply plotted out the course, and Tony kicked off, heading straight to Miami. The security at Mandarin Mansion was laughable. Tony probably would have been able to MacGyver his way inside with Christmas ornaments and some perfectly legal stuff bought from the nearest hardware store. As it was, though, there was a special kind of satisfaction in repulsing everyone's asses in the next week. It didn't change anything. Didn't make him feel any better, not really. It did make him feel less like he was going to scream until he had no throat left. It made the breakdown he could feel closing in on him seem a little bit farther away. Nothing registered, not really, didn't penetrate the strange fog that seemed to have built up around his mind, shut him off from the rest of the world. He noticed things in bits and pieces, like the fact that the fountain was falling apart, and the garden was overgrown, and the security guards were wearing very cheap suits. But none of it connected, none of it became anything whole, significant. And then he was inside, crashing through walls and not giving a shit, because if Jamie was... He couldn't even think it. He just had no more shits to give. None. There was a girl passed out on top of a table. Vaguely, he mused that was a bit strange, but then he let it go. Didn't matter, not in the great scale of things. Tony wasn't entirely sure anything would really matter in his great scale of things again. He pushed that thought away immediately when the roaring black despair threatened to close in around him. A man and a woman were gambling at a table, rambling about the air conditioning or something. Tony didn't care. He let the repulsors loose, half annoyed at the knowledge that Jarvis was overriding him, keeping the blasts non-lethal. He smacked through another door, heard the wood splinter around him. On the HUD, Jarvis made sure to point out the TV screen, paused on the Mandarin. At least Tony hadn't crashed the wrong party, not that there'd been any doubt in the first place. He moved on, crashing through into something that looked halfway between a cheap TV set and a gaudy Bordeaux bedroom. 2 girls were crouched behind the bed, looking at him with frightened eyes, hands in the air. Tony would have repulsored them away, except Jarvis was still overriding him, and screw it, this time he really was deleting that piece of junk collection on scrap code! Behind a door off to the side, a toilet flushed. "Sir?" Jarvis said. "Captain Rogers is attempting to contact you." Tony blocked him out, muttered a mute. Then he focused on the man coming out of the bedroom. Confusion, in the end, was what brought things back into sharp relief. It was the Mandarin, no two ways around it. But he was staggering around speaking about fortune cookies in a slurred British accent, wearing a shabby robe, and just... What even was this? And how had the idiot not noticed Tony, in his stute, standing practically right in front of him? "Hey!" Tony snapped out, forcing his teeth not to grind. He held a hand up in front of himself, pointing the repulsor right at the Mandarin, listened with some satisfaction to the whine as it charged. The Mandarin's eyes focused on Tony, and he jumped, eyes widening, hands coming up above his head to surrender as a fortune cookie dropped to the floor. "What the hell?" he shouted, still in an accent that didn't suit his persona at all. "What the hell, Iron Man? Take whatever you want, except the guns are fake. Those wankers wouldn't trust me with real woods, and... Anyway, if you want one of the birds." Behind the faceplate, Tony blinked, his rage momentarily derailed by the utter incredulity this scene inspired. "What?" he asked. He shook his head, then forced the puzzle pieces to come together into something that made a semblance of sense. "You're not him," he concluded. "The real guy, the Mandarin. Where is he?" When the idiot didn't answer immediately, rage roared through Tony's whole body all over again, and Jamie. Why was this asshole wasting Tony's time when Jamie... "Where?" he heard himself roar. "Where is the Mandarin? Where is he?" "Whoa, whoa, whoa!" The not Mandarin backed away, hands still up, even as he staggered and hunched in on himself, and this guy was pathetic, wasn't he? Which begged the question, again, of who was pulling strings. "Is it? But he's not it." Non-Mandarin finally managed, after he'd somehow maneuvered himself completely into a corner. His voice, the way he was speaking in a calm the crazy down tone, was pissing Tony the hell off. "He's it, but he's not here. He's..." Tony took a step closer, hand still raised, and not Mandarin couldn't seem to look away from the glowing repulsor. "What do you mean?" "It's complicated," not Mandarin said. "Hey, it's complicated." "It is," Tony asked, and he could feel that enraged roar rising up inside him again, threatening to take him over, speak through him. He had half a mind to let it. "Uncomplicated." He glanced over his shoulder where the 2 girls were tittering among themselves and watching the goings-on with dazed eyes. "Ladies, out!" he snapped. He didn't even bother watching as they wrapped themselves in sheets and ran out the door. "Sit down," he told the not Mandarin, gesturing at the bed. Not Mandarin, for whatever fucked up reason, dropped to his hands and knees and began to crawl towards the window. Tony gritted his teeth and fired off a blast that nearly set the idiot's beard on fire. "Sit!" he heard himself scream. Finally, the not Mandarin seemed to give up on whatever he'd been trying to do, got to his feet and flopped down on the bed. For someone who'd just been shot at, he was remarkably, annoyingly calm. Drugged out of his mind, more than likely. He wafted his hands around a bit before letting them drop. "My name's Trevor," he said. "Trevor Slattery." Tony let his hand drop, didn't charge the repulsor back up. He'd have it ready in a moment if he needed it anyway, and as much as he wanted to shoot, right now, even with the biting, nagging anger, he needed answers more than he needed anything. He took a step closer. "What are you?" He forced himself to calm down, to talk like a rational human being, even though he felt the furthest thing from it. "You're a decoy, Bright. A double." "What?" Slattery sounded genuinely offended. "What? No, I'm absolutely not." When Tony raised his hand again, Slattery gave a slight jump, and how did one person swing so violently back and forth between reactions when threatened? "Don't hurt me. I'm an actor," Slattery said, managing to make actor sound like something else completely. "You've got a minute to live," Tony informed him, quickly running out of patience. "Fill it with words." Slattery slumped. "It's just a role," he said, voice far more normal now. "The Mandarin," he added, making a Depp-worthy series of hand gestures. "It's not real." Tony swallowed, felt his carefully laid puzzle fall into pieces all over again. "Then how did you get here, Trevor?" he asked. Slattery moved backwards as Tony advanced, finally placing himself in an armchair and realizing that once again he had nowhere to go. "I had a problem with, substances, and I ended up doing things, there's no two ways about it, in the street that, a man shouldn't do." Tony wanted to scream at him or blow his fucking head off. "Next," he bit out. "Then," Slattery said, "they approached me about a role. They knew about the drugs." Tony bit his tongue until the worst of his frustration had passed. He didn't let himself examine the feelings that were ready at the heels of that frustration. "So what? They get you off them." Slattery looked more than a little confused. "They said they'd give me more. They gave me things. They gave me this place. They gave me plastic surgery. They gave me things." And then he was fucking falling asleep. The asshole was sleeping at repulsor points, and Tony's baby boy was God only knew where and... "Did you just nod off?" He heard the snarl in his own voice and did nothing to bite it back. "Hey!" He lifted his foot and nudged the idiot, not too gently, with the toe of his armored boot. "Oh! I'm a speedboat," Slattery said. The thing is, he needed someone to take credit for some accidental explosions." He made actual finger quotes at that last bit, and Tony was tempted to repulsor him at his spine. And then just like that, the pieces fell into place again, formed a new picture, but this one lacked the holes the old one had had, and Tony felt rage tear through him. He asked through gritted teeth. "Killian, he created you." "He created me," Slattery agreed. "Custom-made terror threat," Tony concluded, his jaw hurt for being clenched too tightly. His eyes stung because why did they have to go and involve his baby boy in all this? What did Jamie have to do with anything? What? Except Tony didn't have the luxury of thinking like that. He had grown up in a family exposed to those kinds of threats. He knew that kind of thinking was useless. Jamie didn't have to have a damn thing to do with anything. It didn't work like that. It didn't... He shook his head, just slightly, pulled himself together by the skin of his teeth. "No breaking down now!" Slattery was still talking, probably had been for a while. He seemed like the type of guy who couldn't get enough of the sound of his own voice. Something about serial killers and Western iconography, and Tony honestly didn't care. It already made sense. He wasn't some baby who needed it all laid out for him. "Of course, it was my performance that brought the Mandarin to life," Slattery concluded. He began to offer Tony a beer, then seemed to think twice about that when he realized the faceplate would be in the way. "Your performance?" Tony asked, and he felt old and wrung out and exhausted, and he wasn't sure how many emotions one person could survive in such a small span of time. He wanted to sob, and he hated himself for it. It wasn't time for that. Not yet. He wasn't done yet. "Where people died." His performance, which had been enough of a distraction to have cost Tony Jamie and... "No. Not now. Not yet." Slattery went on to a rant about theater blood and costumes and production values, and who the fuck even cared? "I'm sorry," Tony said, "but I've got a friend who was in a coma, and he might not wake up. I've got a son who's missing, and..." He had to stop, swallow, hated how weak he was making himself sound. "You're gonna have to answer for that. You're still going down, pal, get it?" He couldn't remember a time when he'd been more off his game, which was the only reason he could think of as to why he didn't realize what it meant when Slattery was staring over his shoulder rather than at him, when he hadn't even noticed the warnings the muted Jarvis had been flashing across the HUD. Only reason he didn't get himself knocked to kingdom come by the man sneaking up behind him was Jarvis taking control of the suit, making him spin and slam a gauntleted fist into a vaguely familiar bald head. The the television said, and Tony spun around to face it, recognizing Killian's smug features immediately. There was a small plastic bag in his hand. Tony just barely recognized the tiny, faintly bloody tip nestled within.
"I wouldn't do that if I were you,"
Killian said. Then he stepped to the side, revealing what looked like a primitive clinic of some kind. And there on the bed, lying mostly still but clearly alive, staring at the camera with wide, frightened eyes, Jamie! Jamie was alive.